Okay. Welcome to meeting number 106 of the Standing Committee on International Trade. Before we begin, I'd like to ask all members and remind everyone that other in-person participants to consult the cards on the table for guidelines to prevent audio feedback incidents. Please take note of the following preventative measures in place to protect the health and safety of all participants, including the interpreters. Only use a black-approved earpiece. The former gray earpieces must no longer be used. Keep your earpiece away from all microphones at all times. When you are not using your earpiece, place it face down on the sticker placed on the table for this purpose. Thank you for all your cooperation. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format. For members in the room, please raise your hand if you wish to speak. For members on Zoom, please raise the raise hand function. A reminder that all comments should go through the chair. If any technical issues arise, please inform me immediately. Otherwise, we will suspend to ensure interpretation is available for everyone. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Tuesday, October 17th, the committee is beginning its study of the effects of American and European seafood import policies on the fishing industry in Canada. You should have all received a copy of a draft study budget of approximately $20,000 for the study of effects of American and European seafood import policies on the fishing industry. Anyone have any concerns with that budget? Move approval. Thank you very much. We have with us today for our first panel from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Sylvain Vezina, Regional Director General, Quebec Region by video conference, and Adwaite Tiwari, Director Trade and Market Policy, and Todd Williams, Acting Director General, Fisheries Resource Management. And following that, we will have the Department of Agriculture and Agri-Food, Michelle Cooper, Director General, Market Access Secretariat. Welcome to you all. You understand how these processes work, so we started our meeting so that we can hear from all of you. We will, at the appropriate time, suspend for the vote and then resume again following the vote with approval from the committee members. Okay, Mr. Tiwari, I invite you to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, please.
Bonjour, Madame la Présidente et membres du comité.
Hello, Madam Chair and members of the committee. My name is Adwaite Tiwari, Director of Trade and Market Policy of Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
Fisheries Resource Management, and Sylvain Vezina, Regional Director General from Quebec Region. Je suis heureux d'avoir l'occasion de me présenter devant ce comité.
I'm happy to have the opportunity to appear in front of this committee on behalf of the department to talk about the trade of sustainable trade of seafood.
Support the sector's economic growth by helping it access markets and identify opportunities to diversify. My team also contributes towards DFO's mandate to ensure trade in fish and seafood is supported by ambitious bilateral and multilateral trade agreement provisions geared towards sustainability and conservation of marine resources. As part of this work, my team works closely with Global Affairs Canada and Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada. Madame la Présidente, la réputation de Canada en matière de poissons.
The reputation of Canada for high quality and sustainably harvested fish and seafood is well established. We are well positioned to meet certain market access requirements, and the numbers speak for themselves. For example, last year, Canada exported $7.6 billion worth of fish and seafood to 115 countries. Of this figure, $4.9 billion went to the United States, our largest export market, and $421 million to the European Union, our third largest export market.
As we are here today to talk about trade with the United States and the European Union, it is important to note that Canada has trade agreements with both the U.S. and the EU. The Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, and the Canada-European Union Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, or CETA, support consistent and stable market access for our fish and seafood products. Cela dit, Les exigences et les politiques.
That said, market access requirements and policies can evolve over time, and I recognize there are currently some proposed measures, both which may have implications for Canada.
In the United States, this market has distinct requirements, including those related to the U.S. Marine Mammal Protection Act, or MMPA. The MMPA provisions seek to protect marine mammals from being harmed during fishing and aquaculture operations. Starting in 2026, to maintain access to the U.S., harvesting nations that export fish or fish products must have measures in place that are comparable to U.S. standards to reduce the bycatch of marine mammals during commercial fishing and aquaculture operations. Turning now to the EU, a few market access requirements are noteworthy. For instance, in 2009, the European Union introduced a new regulation to ensure that products derived from illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing do not enter that jurisdiction. The EU IUU regulation requires all countries that export fish and seafood to provide a CAT certificate for each shipment exported. In response, Canada developed a CAT certification program. The program supports Canada's role more broadly in preventing, deterring, and eliminating IUU fishing. Je voudrais maintenant me concentrer sur les produits dérivés du phoque.
I'd like to now focus on seal products. The EU was once Canada's largest market for seal products, with sales reaching $5.4 million in 2006. In 2009, the EU introduced regulations that banned the import and sales of all seal products. Since then, sales have been near zero. Some exceptions were introduced in 2015 for Indigenous certified products and goods purchased by travelers for personal use. Despite these exceptions, Canada's market for seal products never recovered.
On May 15, 2024, the European Commission launched an evaluation of the effectiveness of the seal ban. DFO is working closely with stakeholders and federal departments on this process. We want to ensure that the EU takes into consideration the sustainable and humane nature of Canada's seal hunt, that the voices of Canada's sealing sector are heard, and that the EU understands the impact of the ban on our coastal and Indigenous communities. Je vous remercie de votre attention et je répondrai.
Thank you for your attention, and I'll be happy to answer your questions.
Sorry, now we will open the floor for questions. Mr. Martel, for 6 minutes, please.
Merci beaucoup, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you, Madam Chair. To begin, thank you for being here with us today. My question is for Mr. Vizina. I'd like to talk about the new regulations imposed by the United States. I'd like you to elaborate, especially on the restrictions. What impact could that have on Canada? Thank you for the question. My colleagues from Central Administration would be able to, or be better placed to answer your question.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question.
Speaking in relation to the Marine Mammal Protection Act, the MMPA, I guess first in terms of context, this act was first introduced during the Nixon era in the United States, and only more recently was it enforced. In particular, provisions around the protection of marine mammals, and as it relates to the importation of products, seafood, fish and seafood products, to the United States. Under the Act, it does require that those importing fish and seafood to the United States must have a regime which is comparable in terms of the efficacy of measures to the United States. So what that means, for example, when we export snow crab to the United States, and we have measures in place to protect North Atlantic right whales, which are endangered, that the measures that we have may not be identical to the United States, but are seen as, in their eyes, as equally as effective. In terms of what DFO is doing, The United States has requested information from us to ensure that it is comparable, that the measures that we do have. We've provided them with all of this information and replied to various inquiries. They have, however, delayed the implementation of this for another year. The deadline was supposed to be in November of last year, and they have extended that. But we remain, as far as we know, in compliance, and we're working with our U.S. counterparts in that regard to ensure that our products can continue to be exported to the United States.
Est-ce que vous croyez que ces exigences
Do you believe that these requirements are damaging the Quebec fisheries sector? And if yes, how can we minimize the impact?
Thank you very much for the question, Madam Chair. I think, on the contrary, as long as we remain in compliance, in fact, Quebec industry and Canadian industry as a whole will benefit. It is the measures that we have put in place to protect the North Atlantic right whale, as an example, are designed to protect, while at the same time remaining flexible to industry. And we have worked with the various fleets that are impacted to maintain a level of flexibility in that, whether that's adjusting the season date, looking at and investing in new gear, which can be deployed using less rope and less risk of entanglements. This ensures the work that we have been doing helps ensure that we maintain market access to this very important market.
nous au Canada, là, est-ce qu'on impose
And does Canada impose stricter measures on the imports from the United States?
I can't speak to the importation of fish products. That would fall not within the mandate of DFO.
OK.
Or at least fisheries management.
OK. Alors, bon, écoutez bien, dans l'économie bleue, là,
Let's talk about the blue economy. We're talking about, is there anything to do with the economic recipes from recreational fishing?
Sorry, to clarify, is the question that does the blue economy policy have anything to do with the recreational fishery?
oui.
Okay.
Right.
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that question. Our team at Trade and Market Policy does not work on the issue of recreational fishery. I do work in blue economy policy, and our focus has been on supporting our sustainably harvested fish products through commercially managed fisheries.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Martel. Thank you, Mr. Martel. 18 seconds left. Okay, Mr. Miao, please, for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the officials who are being here today for this important study. Of course, Canada produces some of the highest quality seafood, and coming from where I am, British Columbia, geoduck, spot prawn being the season right now. I think to ensure the quality control for all our seafood export, our country relies on CFIA, Canada Food Inspection Agency, to regulate and labeling. And how does the CFIA's... Sorry.
Bells are ringing, so there's a call for a vote, but it's 14 minutes. Would the committee want to continue on and stop 2 minutes before the vote, or do you want longer than that?
Madame la Présidente, si je me trompe pas, il y a...
If I'm not mistaken, there are 2 votes afterwards as well. So there are 3 votes total. Are you suggesting that at the beginning of every vote. Oh, all right. So we can just continue 15 minutes and then we have to do all the votes, right? Successively?
Go back to our work.
I would, Madam.
Yes, Mr. Cannings?
I'm guessing that these will be very short bells. They won't be. 15-minute bells. I know, but that's what they call the bells right after QP, 15-minute bells, and they never are.
Well, they've called it, so it's 13 minutes and 48 seconds now.
Okay, so, well, let's keep going and then, but
Okay, if
then there'll be
everybody's in
3 in a
agreement,
row
we'll
without bells, so.
We'll stop 2 minutes before this vote, then go back to our work, and then we'll do the next vote.
There's 3 votes in a row, so.
Yeah. So if they're complete, if there's no bells in between.
We can't come back to our work. We got to
No.
do the votes.
So we will stop
Yep.
in 2 minutes to the vote, and we will resume following the third vote. All right? Sorry, Mr. Meow.
No problem. Let me start the question again. So, to ensure quality control for our seafood export, Canada relies on CFIA on their labeling and regulation. How does the CFIA's regulatory framework compare with our American and European counterpart in this case?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that question. To support our sector in terms of their exports around the world, we do work closely with the CFIA, but I cannot speak to their regulations. That's probably best directed to the CFIA.
Can you share with us what are the difference in regulatory framework between Canada and other countries?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. This is from a CFIA perspective about their regulations. I would suggest that be redirected to the CFIA. I'm not familiar with those regulations. Those are not for DFO.
Oh, okay. Well, I'll move on to the next question. So the seafood industry is valued at over $4 billion in Atlantic Canada right now. And the industry is vital to the economies of coastal and indigenous communities. But the processing of seafood is regulated by the province. Are there variation in regulation between the Atlantic provinces when it comes to seafood processing?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that question. That would not be something within the purview of our team. We work on trade and market policy issues. But if there's interest, we can respond to any questions and follow up.
Okay. And why not, if you may share some of the insight of how much seafood is being traded right now between Canada and the Americans and also the European countries?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. In terms of trade statistics, that information is something we do have, and that is also publicly available. The U.S. remains our biggest market. So, for example, to give you a figure, in 2023, the total exports to the U.S. were about $4.9 billion, and the exports to the European Union in 2023 were $421 million. Mm-hmm. And the total seafood exports from Canada in 2023 were $7.6 billion.
Mm-hmm. Okay. If you can share, if
Yes.
there's more data, share with the committee, please. But let's get into how we are protecting our seafood sector right now. What are the things Canada can do to ensure that our waters are able to literally support the marine life so that we don't see any loss of the ecosystem due to climate change or other, effects of the important aquatic species?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for that question. That is not something our team is directly implicated in terms of exports. Our focus really is about helping the sector when they are selling their products to other countries or other markets. But if this question general about climate change, for example, or ocean science or marine protection, that will be for other parts of DFO, and we could respond as a follow-up if there's interest.
And what is,
I'm sorry, Mr. Miao, your time is up at this point. Mr. Savard Tremblay, please.
Merci à l'ensemble des témoins. Merci, Madame.
Thank you to all the witnesses, and thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for the representatives of the department. I'll provide some context. Last November, we learned that the United States was going to delay their decision. They have until the end of 2025 to evaluate the practices of their commercial partners. They will be assessing whether or not the protection of certain mammals are up to par. I'm going to quote here. They say that some fishing could cause some death to marine mammals in certain areas, which is in fishing areas that are frequented by Quebec fishermen. So, simply put, the department could prevent Quebec and Canada from accessing their market starting January 1st, 2026, if they consider that the measures are not respected. So this means that we might go into litigation. So you have statistics. Can we have the stats on the amount of fishing jobs we have here to begin with?
Thank you for this question. It's about data on fishing jobs. We can check within DFO whether we have that data available.
Donc là, actuellement, vous savez pas le nombre de
So you don't know how many fishermen there are in Quebec and Canada right now?
I don't have the data right in front of me right now. We can ask the economic shop within DFO whether they have that information.
Ce serait fort utile, en effet.
Indeed, that would be quite useful if we feel that there is a potential trade war with the Americans. We would need to know how many jobs are at risk, at the very least. I am not reassured at all by this information. Are there any discussions with the United States on this topic?
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, for the question. I think it's important to note that we have very good relations with the U.S. government at a variety of levels, both at the working level and at more senior levels, regarding the implementation and compliance under their Marine Mammal Protection Act. Certainly, we have received no indication to date that we are not in compliance with the provisions of their legislation. And DFO is doing everything within its power to ensure that the United States has all of the information that it needs to make those determinations. And certainly we can follow up on the statistics. It is challenging even to sometimes classify exactly those numbers in terms of who is dependent on the fishery, who's a license holder, and then more broadly in the processing sector. But we do have that information. We can follow up in writing to the committee.
Mais ça, je veux bien qu'il y ait des discussions puis que les relations soient...
So I understand that there are exchanges and that the relationship is positive, but there are other conflicts in other industries. Every time that there's litigation, we are given reason. There are protectionist measures that can be put in place very quickly. This is, almost tomorrow morning, January 1st, 2026. To say that there are conversations happening right now is all well and good, but I want to make sure that we are prepared. What measures are you taking right now to prepare?
Thanks very much for the question, Madam Chair. We are in regular contact with our counterparts, again, at a variety of levels within the United States. We know in conversations with other countries that we're receiving the same information that they are in terms of the U.S. government's ongoing work to implement the MMPA. I can't speak to perhaps broader trade issues with respect that the honourable member had mentioned. But certainly on this particular file, I can say the relation is very good. Relationship, sorry.
Combien de temps exactement, Madame la Présidente?
How much time do I have left?
15 seconds.
Parfait. On sait aussi que
There are parts of the seal that are useful as bait for lobster fishers. Is that correct? What can you say about the Americans' policy in that regard?
Thank you very much for that question. A few points for context. One, DFO does not regulate bait and what's used as bait. That is really a decision by fish harvesters. Two, there was a company and perhaps others who were exploring the use of seal and seal parts as bait and was seeing some success in regard to that. However, the question was posed to DFO on whether or not those who fished using seal as bait would be in compliance or not with the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So we asked the United States government, and unfortunately, they informed us that those harvesters who fished using seal as bait, it would not be in compliance of the MMPA and would further risk more broadly all exports of that species to the United States.
Okay, Mr. Kettings, would you like 1 minute to get a question for any of these witnesses?
Will I have an opportunity later?
By the time we finish, we'll be into the next round of witnesses, I'm afraid.
Well, perhaps we should have shortened the rounds, but I'd like at least a minute.
Go right ahead.
Okay, I don't know what to do now. Maybe I'll go to the...
Keep going, Mr. Kettings. We'll give you as much as we can.
I'll start with seals and see how far I get. I'm just interested in this comment that you made that the EU is reconsidering or reanalyzing the sealing ban. I'm just wondering what that ban was based on. Was it sustainability, or was it just the fact that seals are mammals and the method of the hunt? Which was it, and why are they reconsidering that?
Thank you, Madam Chair, for the question. The EU says that they were concerned about the way the seals were being hunted, and just last week they announced that they would be seeking feedback on the EU regulations about the ban. The consultations launched on May 15th and will go on until August 7th, so another couple of months. And there are a couple of exceptions to the current ban. One is the indigenous exception, so that products that are certified as Harvest of Indigenous. And so we are working with stakeholders, with indigenous communities, with the governments of Northwest Territories and Nunavut to provide our perspective.
Okay, and just quickly on the other issues with the MMPA, how are the American methods different from ours, and why do they have to even consider what we're doing? Because it seems like we're doing a lot.
Thank you very much for that question. It's important to understand that the regulatory environment and context within the United States is different than in Canada. In many respects, the regulatory system within DFO is in some cases superior. We have the flexibility to dynamically open and close certain fishing areas where marine mammals such as the North Atlantic right whale may be present, and they can't easily do that. So they look at other measures as a way to mitigate risk, including looking at the type of gear that is used, how much gear, in what capacity.
Okay, thank you very much. My apologies to our witnesses, but the time is short. We will suspend until we've completed the 3 votes. Thank you. President by video conference, and the Canadian Whale Institute, Myra Brown, Senior Scientist by video conference. Welcome all. We will start with opening remarks from both of you. Mr. Sproul, I invite you to give opening remarks for up to 5 minutes, please.
Madam Chair, thank you very much for this opportunity to share our views. I appear before you today on behalf of the Bay of Fundy Inshore Fishermen's Association, where I serve as president. For 28 years, we have represented owner-operator fishing families on the shores of the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. Our group has a distinguished history of advocating for sustainable fishing practices and community-based fisheries management. Over this time, our commitment to responsible use of resources has led us to partnerships with many groups in academia and the conservation community. We have a history of cooperation with governments and regulators at all levels, earning us a reputation as a valuable ally on ocean issues. Our members are proud of this legacy and committed to preserving our way of life for future generations of Nova Scotians. Today, more than ever, international regulatory developments are having a direct effect on harvesters. In the past, these issues were more the concern of the export side of the industry, but today fishermen face direct calls for action on our part. The most prominent of these today is the United States Marine Mammal Protection Act and the need for Canadian fishermen to comply with similar standards to retain market access in the U.S. for Canadian seafood products. To facilitate this, a massive effort has taken place and continues to evolve as conservation groups and fishing organizations work cooperatively with regulators to assure our American friends that we can and will do our part to conserve and protect marine mammals on our fishing grounds. We believe this cooperative approach is the correct one and has been guided by organizations like the Canadian Whale Institute and the Canadian Wildlife Federation. These groups in particular understand the needs and priorities of the fishing industry and make great efforts to seek our work collaboratively with harvesters. The Government of Canada can assist in these important developments by continuing to create room for industry perspectives when considering funding of NGO projects in this sphere. It's a fact that our industry can cooperate with these organizations and achieve better outcomes for all stakeholders when our views are respected and included in decision-making. It's incumbent on government to support their important work and not groups who only seek to obstruct an industry so important to our economy. And it's imperative that the government strives to communicate our successes to American regulators and consumers. Many inaccuracies reported in the U.S. go unchallenged by DFO. Most recently, American regulators have mandated an increase to the minimum size lobster that can be harvested in U.S. waters in an effort to boost the numbers of juvenile lobster in the Gulf of Maine. This has presented Canadian harvesters with a dilemma. Do we follow suit and increase our minimum size? This would result in lower initial landings due to a size class of lobster being thrown back that was previously harvestable. On the other hand, not taking any action could result in the loss of U.S. market access, something our industry cannot afford as America represents a significant share of the marketplace. There are still areas where more work must be done. One is the connecting of inshore independent harvesters directly to international marketplaces. This valuable idea has seen little effort by government. Perhaps most important to note is the failure of this government to appoint a Fisheries Conservation Ambassador of Canada to represent our industry on behalf of all Canadians. This negligence sometimes makes the industry voiceless at international tables or sees our voice replaced by transnational ENGOs with their own self-serving agendas and foreign funding. The truth is that we have a story that deserves to be told abroad, a positive one of respect for the waters that we rely on, of a commitment to science-based fisheries management, and of the will to work cooperatively with our domestic and international partners in an effort to build value and sustainability in Atlantic Canada's most important industry. Thank you, committee members. I invite your questions.
Thank you very much. Ms. Brown, the floor is yours, please, for up to 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair, committee members. My name is Dr. Moira Brown, and I'm a senior scientist with the Canadian Whale Institute, located on Campobello Island, New Brunswick, on the shores of the Bay of Fundy. I'm also Scientist Emerita at the New England Aquarium in Boston, Massachusetts. My research career has spanned 39 years, and it has been focused on the science and conservation of the critically endangered North Atlantic right whale throughout its range in Canada and the United States. Some of the results of this research have been used to develop right whale recovery and action plans in Canada under the Species at Risk Act. Early on, my conservation work focused on working with the shipping industry to reduce the risk of vessel whale collisions in the Maritimes. And I led a working with industry stakeholders and scientists, Canadian government regulators, and many mariners to gain the adoption of two measures that have reduced the risk of vessel strikes in the Bay of Fundy and south of Nova Scotia on Rosaway Basin, the two critical habitats for North Atlantic right whales. Starting in about 2010, right whales have demonstrated a shift in their habitat, and many have moved from the Gulf of Maine and the Bay of Fundy to areas in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. However, they still do continue to come to the two critical habitat areas, just not for as long or in anywhere near as many numbers. More recently, I'm working on Canada's response to entangled whales in partnership with the DFO, Fisheries and Oceans Marine Mammal Response Program. The Campobello Whale Rescue Team is part of the Canadian Whale Institute, and we are the primary responder for entangled whales in the waters of the Maritime Provinces in Quebec. And so that includes the Bay of Fundy around Nova Scotia, southern Gulf of St. Lawrence, and the St. Lawrence Estuary. We've also started working with fish harvesters over the last few years in these waters to try and reduce entanglement through various means, including trials with rope-on-demand technology, also called by some whale safe gear. I continue to participate with several government-led advisory groups to reduce large vessel strikes throughout Canadian waters on the East Coast and entanglement in commercial fishing gear. We've had terrific success working with fishers on these issues, and most of our responders on our whale rescue team are actually fish harvesters themselves, who started as volunteers in this work and are now on standby to respond about 8 months of the year. I hope I can help you with your questions, and I look forward to it. Thank you.
Much, Ms. Brown. On to Mr. Baldinelli for 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here this afternoon. I'm going to start with Mr. Sproul, and thank you for your testimony. And I can readily see, having the officials here earlier, the importance of the fishery sector. I mean, $7.6 billion in exports to 115 countries, but of course, our number one market, that being the U.S. at $4.9 billion alone. Mr. Sproul, you talked about a couple of things. I mean, not only your organization, association, and its membership, and the concept of the responsible actions that you're taking. And then you talked about some of the concerns that you had. And one of them, you referenced this fisheries ambassador and the notion that there's been no fisheries ambassador, and it leaves us, Canada, kind of voiceless at international conferences and so on, and no true champion for Canada. Now, has that position been vacant for a while, or has Canada had previous ambassadors appointed?
Madam Chair, I thank the member for the question. Yes, the position had existed in the past. It was terminated by the federal government in 1996. In 2007, the Harper government appointed Canada's last fisheries ambassador, but since fisheries ambassador for conservation, rather, and since the current government's tenure, there has been no ambassador appointed, which I truly feel is a big loss for the industry, and in that the ambassador would have the best interests of all Canadian stakeholders in the fishery at mind, and would be a champion for the Canadian industry, and help to tell a good story abroad that really deserves to be told about the high levels of protection that all Canada sees and enjoy, and about the collaborative efforts that have taken place by groups like the Canadian Whale Institute.
Yeah, well, I think you've answered my question on how the ambassador can help advance Canada's fishing interests, so thank you for that in your comments. You also referenced foreign interests obstructing Canadian fisheries. Can you expand upon this?
Well, I was recently alarmed to see the Department of Fisheries and Oceans collaborating with some American NGOs like IFAW, who I don't feel have been conducive to solving the right whale issue here. And on one hand, we really hope for the minister and for representatives of the government to change the dialogue of the conversation within America about what Canadians' efforts are and aren't in whales. And then on the other hand, we see the department supporting initiatives outside of Canada, which we think are counterproductive to that. And certainly there are environmental non-government organizations within Canada who receive funding from outside of Canada, and we also have a take serious issue with that.
And I think you raised it in some of your comments. You talked about kind of three areas, and in your first point was talking about establishing more of a collaborative relationship with the government and looking towards organizations such as yourself when they're looking at funding opportunities. Right now, you've talked about examples of how they're funding some NGOs outside of the country, but not taking into consideration Canadian viewpoints and Canadian actions such as your association and the efforts that you're putting in. And if you could elaborate on that a little bit further.
Well, I think first, just to be clear, let me say that my belief is that not all NGOs are created equal, and I just want to be clear that I and my membership have the highest respect for the Canadian Whale Institute and the Canadian Wildlife Federation. They're two groups that I believe have really moved the dial on the conservation of whales in Canadian waters, and they've made it possible for people like me to take that message to fish harvesters, and that they know that their views are respected. They know that groups like these care about the interests of fishermen. So I think it's just important to note that I'm not meaning to disparage environmental non-government organizations. I think that the successes that we've enjoyed in conservation in Canada are largely responsible to them. So I just wanted to point that out, that I think that they come in different forms, and I think some of them are more interested in their own operations and self-preservation than better outcomes for whales.
More fulsome kind of dialogue and comments from all groups would be more than helpful. How much time, Madam Chair? Okay, now quickly, there's the Marine Mammal Protection Act in the United States, but there are other rules and regulations that Canadian fishermen and exporters have to follow. Now, are there on the side of, on the health side, for example, on fish exports? I mean, when we look at other sectors in the Canadian economy with regards to food exports, you have issues such as sanitary, photosanitary measures that are used as almost non-tariff barriers. Are you finding on the health side that there are rules and regulations, say, for example, in the United States, that are not helpful or kind of preclude Canadian fish products from getting into the United States?
I think I would be speaking out of turn to comment on that question, given that my perspectives are largely limited to the harvesting side of the industry. But I think it's a question that will be best posed in the next committee meeting, where I know that representatives of the export sector and lobster processing sector will be present, including the Lobster Council of Canada that represents the Bay of Fundy Inshore Fishermen's Association and a myriad of other inshore fishing groups across Canada on the issue. I think it's a question best answered by them.
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm sorry, you're like over. Ms. Fortier, please.
Merci, Madame la Présidente, et merci à vous deux.
Thank you very much. Thank you to the both of you for being here this afternoon. I'd like to share something with you. One of my concerns is the following. There are effects of climate change. So when we're talking about fishing and the Canadian industry, products from seafood products, we really have to take a moment and look at how climate change is impacting that industry. We've observed an increase of 2% in the Saint Laurent River, of 2 degrees in the Saint Laurent River, which has had a lot of impact on some fisheries. When we talk about protecting the Canadian fisheries industry, what can Canada do to make sure that the water can literally support marine life in order to prevent ecosystem loss and of important aquatic species? I'll ask Ms. Brown to answer first, and then I'll ask Mr. Sproul, or I'll invite Mr. Sproul to answer. Ms. Brown?
Thank you for your question. My comments will only be restricted to whales. I'm not a fisheries biologist, just a whale biologist. So what we have noticed since 2010 is a change in the habitat of North Atlantic right whales. So right whales typically came up into the Bay of Fundy and could be found there between June and December, but primarily August, September, October each year. And those studies began by colleagues at the New England Aquarium in 1980, and we saw a pretty persistent distribution of those whales seasonally and in numbers for about 30 years. And 2010 came along, we started to see fewer right whales and greater variability in numbers each year. 2016 was more of a normal year, and since then, we've literally had just a handful of right whales seen in the Bay of Fundy, 5 to 6 a year. These animals can be individually identified, so they are photographed elsewhere. We know they're still alive. They're seen in their southern habitats along the U.S. coast. They're also seen some in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. The area off Rosaway Basin, these areas are not surveyed as often as they used to be. Grant funders like you to actually find right whales when you go out for surveys. But the Canadian government does continue to do aerial surveys out there, and there are some acoustic listening devices. And so at this point, with an estimated population of about 360 right whales, that's the whole species, about 140 of them are returning to the Gulf of St. Lawrence each summer. The remaining ones, their location in the summertime is actually not known.
Wow. So this is problematic, as you can share at this time. I might ask the same question to Mr. Sproul that I asked earlier.
Thank you for the question. In my view, the best way the government can support, a changing environment and its effect on fisheries is to support fisheries science at a large scale within the department, but also at a smaller scale in industry-led science and partnerships that lobster and other harvesters are involved in all across the Atlantic provinces. I'm actually the president of the Southwest Lobster Science Society, and a lot of our members and a lot of fishermen in Southwest Nova Scotia very focused on lobster science. But we find, that funding for that can be very hard to come by. We'd love to be able to collaborate with our international partners, and just this past fall we weren't able to attend what's the preeminent lobster management science convention in the world because the department refused to fund it. So I think that a focus on science and a better understanding of fishery resources and how they're changing is how the government should be helping the industry directly.
Thank you. And maybe Mr. Sproul, one last minute that I have. Do you have any other suggestions, as you understand, of course, that there is a need for this economy or sector to continue to flourish? Is there any other recommendations you would have for a committee?
Well, I think in terms of the subject of the committee, in terms of international trade, one of the most important actions right now that can take place by the government is for government representatives, for the Minister of Fisheries and others, to tell the good news story of Canadian fisheries. Because, from my view, I've never seen a government, so ready to disparage itself, its own fishermen and its own industry. I know that Canada's fisheries are incredibly well managed overall, and that our oceans are subject to some of the most stringent protections in the world. And I think that it's really incumbent on the government at this point to let everybody else in the world know that too, especially in our consumer markets in Europe and America.
Thank you so much.
Mr. Sherrod Tremblay, please, for 6 minutes.
Oui, merci, Madame la Présidente. Merci.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you to our witnesses. Mrs. Brown, you are the head researcher for the Canadian Whale Institute. We heard the president of the Bay of Fundy and Shore Fishermen's Association that they are questioning the American science behind their decisions and saying that it was essentially just political. What are your thoughts on that?
Thank you for your question. There's always been a lot of politics around right whales on both sides of the the border, but I will say in Canada that the measures that the Canadian government is taking to reduce the risk of entanglement and the risk of vessel strikes is unprecedented anywhere in the world, and it exceeds what is being done in the U.S.
Donc, du côté des Américains qui...
So you have no doubt about the fact that your scientific, or according to your scientific knowledge, the fears by the Americans are unfounded.
The Americans are trying to have a level playing field for the protection measures against human-related mortality for right whales in both vessel strikes and entanglements. And perhaps there was a time when some of their measures exceeded ours, but since 2017, Canada has really increased the level of protection for right whales. We're not there yet. We still have human-related mortality and serious injury affecting the reproduction on this population, but we've come really a long way since 2017, and I believe our measures exceed those that are the ones that are used in the U.S. right now.
Merci. Alors, on en prendra note.
Thank you. We'll take note of that. Mr. Sproul? Is there anything else you would like to add on the non-scientific nature of the Americans' decisions before we move on?
I just think I'd add that it's important for the committee to understand that there's a fundamental difference in the relationship between Canadian fishermen and Canadian conservation groups and American fishermen and American conservation groups, and that there's been a much more oppositional approach. And I think that's, some people in the U.S. would like to attribute that to fishermen, but I think it needs to be attributed to groups like the International Fund for Animal Welfare, who have taken an incredibly aggressive approach towards fishermen, including suing individual American fishermen who are attempting to collaborate on conservation. So, I think that that's what's led to some of that animosity, and there are misrepresentations about what's taking place in Canada from all the stakeholders in the U.S., and I wouldn't just attribute it to the veracity of science. I think it's more related to politics.
Avez-vous également, dites-moi, dans votre baie, dans la baie de Fundy, est-ce que...
In the Bay of Fundy, well, I'm looking to make some parallels. Of course, fishing is very important in Quebec. How much fishing is there in your area?
The Bay of Fundy is the most diverse marine ecosystem on the face of the earth, and fishing is, incredibly important, foundationally important to the communities that line the Bay of Fundy. It's, fishery products are our largest export in Nova Scotia. So I can't overemphasize how important it is to our communities, and it's the only bulwark between an economic renaissance that we've seen in coastal communities in Atlantic Canada and the economic downturn that's so prevalent everywhere else. So I can't stress enough what a diffuse economic benefit it is delivered to.
Oui, excusez-moi, sur l'importance de la pêche, j'en doute pas.
I'm sure that, of course, fishing is very important, but maybe I was a little bit quick. Is there any lobster fishing in the Bay of Fundy?
Yeah, certainly there is. Lobster is really king in the Bay of Fundy. I think we calculated nearly $1 billion worth from the Bay of Fundy alone last year.
Alors, vous êtes au courant des politiques américaines?
You must be aware of the American measures that prevent seal hunting for bait for lobsters, which means that these are protectionist measures that can have pretty serious consequences.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of concerns in the lobster industry right now about access to bait, especially considering the moratorium on fishing pelagic species like mackerel and what that's meant. So, yeah. Bait is a chief concern, and I'm sure there are lots of fishermen who would like to see the development of seal products for bait, and hopefully, not at the expense of market access.
Avez-vous déjà pu constater des conséquences?
Have you noted any of the consequences yet, or is it more a fear and a threat for now?
Yes, I think they're largely imagined consequences at this point. There's not widespread use of seal products for lobster bait.
Avez-vous été en contact avec les officiels?
Have you been in contact with Canadian officials on this topic in order to try to face this challenge?
I think that the dialogue between Canadian officials and the industry could certainly stand room for improvement. There's an international dialogue as well that's great, and there are things like the Canada-U.S. Town Hall Lobster Meeting, which really helps to improve the dialogue between the industries. But there's certainly room for the government to improve on its consultation with the fishing industry on all of these issues. And I think I wouldn't be honest if I said that we ever had good consultations with the issues that we're discussing today.
Thank you very much. Mr. Cannings for 6 minutes.
Well, thank you both for being here. I'm going to start with Dr. Brown, just to get an idea of the difference, if any, between the Canadian and American situation with right whales in terms of their distribution and behavior when they're there, how many are there. I assume they have their calves further south and move up into the northern waters, northern New England waters, and into the Bay of Fundy, Gulf of St. Lawrence in the summer. Are most of them in Canadian waters in the summer?
You have, thank you for your question. You have the distribution down pat. The only known calving ground is down off the coast of Florida and Georgia. The animals migrate up towards New England, Cape Cod Bay in the spring. They've just departed that region, and they're now, as usual, probably heading across the Gulf of Maine and just starting to show up in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. So again, because we can identify these whales as individuals, we do have a good sense of who is actually in the Gulf of St. Lawrence or elsewhere. And so it's slightly less than half the population annually. About 140 or so individuals have been returning to the Gulf on a pretty regular basis, Gulf of St. Lawrence, that is, since 2017. And that is a direct results of very thorough surveillance efforts by DFO Science, by NGO research groups like Canadian Whale Institute, and also NOAA in the U.S. has a survey plane that comes up for a few weeks each year to help with the count.
I'm just wondering if American fishers face the same restrictions or, the same mitigating measures that Canadian fishers have taken with regards to gear to reduce entanglements. Do American shipping interests have to reduce speed the same way that Canadians do? Is it kind of an equal thing, or is it most of this happening in Canada, and is that part of the problem?
There are definitely measures in both countries that are different. Some are narrowly tailored to the particular area or the particular habitat where the whale is. In Canada, we have static measures to reduce vessel strikes that are in place from end of April until middle of November that are mandatory, that are monitored and enforced by Transport Canada. The speed limit in the seasonally restricted area is even, it's actually 8 less, 10 knots or less in the other areas. And I think the key thing is that these measures are monitored and enforced. In the U.S., vessel strike measures can be mandatory, but the measures are not enforced the same way. They're not monitored and enforced on a near real-time basis. With respect to fisheries, when a right whale is encountered in the east coast of Canada, approximately 670 square nautical miles are closed to fishing around that one sighting of one right whale at a minimum for 15 days. If the whales persist, then that fishery is closed for the season. That's far stricter than anything that's going on in the U.S., and the U.S. doesn't have a similar dynamic system. They have some static closures, without a doubt, in high-use areas where there's fishing and whale overlap, but they don't have a similar dynamic system.
So if I'm correct, I think we heard from the previous witnesses that the Americans are assessing the Canadian conservation measures to see if they're equivalent to the American ones. And I don't know, it seems to me listening to what you're saying, a real expert, that we, if anything, are ahead of the Americans, and it's fairly obvious. It's not some subtle thing. I'm just wondering if that's how you see the situation.
Yes, I do. In addition, our measures are adapted each year. So there are a number of Fisheries and Oceans and Transport Canada-led advisory groups and technical working groups that look at the data each year, and they assess the measures that are in place, the protective measures, and they have evolved over the last 6 years, quite a bit, 6-7 years. In the U.S., some of the measures were put in place in excess of 10, 12 years ago and are just now being considered for adaptation in response to shifting habitat of the whales. I'm actually really proud of what Canada has done, the protective measures that have been put in place. As I said earlier, we're not there yet. We haven't eliminated the human caused mortality and serious injury for this species, but the measures that are in place are widespread. They're monitored, they're enforced. And I will also add that it is the fish harvesters that are out there that are complying with these measures and the captains of the ships as well that are working really hard to recover this species.
30 seconds. Well, I just want to quickly go to Mr. Spruill and say, if this is the case, is there some pressure from American fishers, or is it the American government? What's causing this this difference, and how do you feel about that?
Thanks for the question. Well, I think it's best to understand where the pressure on the American government is coming from. The pressure on the American government is coming from ENGOs like IFAW and the Pew Trust, and they're also engaging in punitive lawsuits against fishermen and state regulators as well in America. So they're certainly under political pressure, and they're also under political pressure from American fishermen themselves who are rebelling against some of the measures that we've cooperated on here in Canada. So yeah, it is concerning to us, and I think it comes back to the fact that it's incumbent on the Minister of Fisheries to be advocating for Canadian fishermen and Canadian conservationists in America with their counterparts, and to make sure that good news story, which Dr. Brown has related to you, gets told in America to conservationists, to governments and regulators, and most importantly to consumers.
Thank you very much. On to Mr. Seaback for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Just trying to go back to what Mr. Spruill, what you were talking about. What are the ENGOs in the United States trying to push for that can cause or are causing the challenges for Canadian fishers?
Well, namely, it's parity with the Marine Mammal Protection Act, or the appearance of it. But as Dr. Brown has said, that there's a lot of feelings that we're on parity with it now. So essentially, what they're pushing for is in a sense to transfer the blame entirely to Canadian fishermen for the sorry state of right whales, where Canadian fishermen accept that entanglements are certainly a chief contributing factor to the demise of the whales, but we also recognize that they don't all take place in Canadian waters, and we recognize the extreme impact of ship strikes on the whales too. So we are, we're not looking for the government to paint a picture that isn't true, but we'd just like to see credit given where credit is due, and blame given where blame is due.
Am I correct in saying that this is sort of the, I'm going to call it the enforcement of the Marine Mammal Protection Act, although I don't know if that's the right word. This seems to be a new development in the United States. Am I correct with that? This is sort of an older statute that has suddenly been revived and seems to be putting pressure on Canadian fishers?
Yes, I would say that that's correct. Under the Biden administration, I think there's been more focus on the conservation of whales, but it's also due to the fact that there have been, a significant amount of ship strikes and entanglements as well, and it's also the emergence of it as an issue is also due to the fragile nature of the right whale population.
And what you seem to be saying, though, is that the way to deal with this, because we are doing enough, it seems like I'm hearing from both witnesses that we are doing enough here to protect the right whales. The issue seems to be making sure that message is heard in Washington. And what would your advice be if either the Prime Minister or the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans were here today to say, we would like you to do X, Y, Z with the United States because we're doing the right thing?
I think first I would pose a question. Why is the Government of Canada working collaboratively with groups in the U.S. to fund what we feel are misinformation campaigns that entirely level the blame on entanglements and on Canadian fishermen?
How exactly are they doing that?
Documentaries that we don't feel are very accurate, and they seem to be proud to put the DFO byline in the funding announcements with groups like IFAW and the Pew Trust and Oceans North here in Canada, who fishermen don't feel have the best interests of the fishing industry at heart. So I think that what I would tell the Prime Minister or the Minister of Fisheries is that why would Canadian regulators, why would Canadian governments disparage Canadians in another country, and why aren't they singing the praises of the efforts that have been made by groups like the Canadian Wildlife Federation, the Canadian Whale Institute, and all the fishermen's groups that have worked collaboratively with them, instead of continuing to push what we see sometimes as a radical agenda in Canada and the U.S.?
Well, we see increasingly radical agendas pushed by this Prime Minister on a number of issues. Thanks very much. Those are my questions.
Mr. Sidhu, please, for 5 minutes.
Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thanks to our witnesses for taking the time to join us here today. Dr. Brown, I understand that a big part of the work that your organization does involves education and stewardship. Could you share more information with our committee about each of these programs, their objectives, and why they are so important?
Thank you very much. We focus our stewardship activities with the two industries that have had the biggest impact on North Atlantic right whales. So that's the shipping industry and the fishing industry. And we do that right from almost backyard dockside chats with fishermen on the docks, not only where we live and operate, but also where we go to respond to entangled whales. We go to trade shows. We've also expanded recently to recreational boating shows. And part of that is to try and encourage reporting of entangled whales, because the sooner we can get to them and try to disentangle them, the better chance for survival that whale has. So we're really focused on the two industries where the accidental harm to right whales occurs. And these are accidents.
And you also mentioned some of the research, and research goes hand in hand with education. Could you share with our committee the latest research initiatives that your organization has conducted and perhaps the findings?
Yes, we launch teams out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence now every summer since the whales have relocated there. We are not doing research as much in the Bay of Fundy as we used to, and not at all south of Nova Scotia, simply because we're going to where we expect to find the whales. We contribute to the photo identification programs that are maintained through the catalog of individual whales at the New England Aquarium. All organizations that work on right whales contribute to that catalog so that we can track the population, track scarring, track health assessments, track reproduction, births, deaths, all of the different life history parameters for this species. We also have an extensive genetics program right here in Canada at St. Mary's University in Halifax that is tackling the inbreeding problem. And I will say very quickly that right whales have a small gene pool. There's only 360 whales, but they are essentially taking care of business themselves through what's called genetic purging, in that inbred calves do not survive, whereas the calves that do survive have fairly high genetic diversity, and it points well for the population. We won't have as many calves, but the calves that we do have will, let's say, have the good genes.
Perfect. All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Gerard Tremblay, please, for 2.5 minutes.
Monsieur Sproul, dites-moi combien il y a...
Mr. Sproul, can you tell me how many people you represent, more or less?
Sorry about that. We represent nearly 200 fishing families along the Nova Scotia coastline of the Bay of Fundy, and they employ nearly 750 fishermen.
Parfait, donc on voit que c'est un secteur quand même.
So this is a very important sector locally and regionally. One can assume that in many such regions, there are other, there might be a crisis that would have major consequences on many jobs. If we once again look at the danger and threat of American protectionism, there are decisions that might be rendered with regards to the right whale. And there's also boycott of lobster products, or rather seal products being used for bait. Is there anything else that we should take note of besides these two factors?
I would just also note that some of the mitigation measures that are taken within Canada to mitigate ship and right whale entanglements have had, and can have extreme effects on our industry, and that all fishing in an area can be prevented. We're right in the middle of a crisis right now in the Gulf of St. Lawrence due to the presence of a right whale, and at the start of a very important lobster fishery for the economies of the Acadian Peninsula in New Brunswick. And I think that the protection of the whales is certainly a duty of Canada and of the industry. But because it's a duty of Canada and Canadians, I think that the government needs to consider support for industries that are incredibly affected by that. And that support can take the terms of financial support, but it can also take the support of better science and better observation and better overflights to determine when whales are in an area, and importantly when they've left an area, and where exactly they've been sighted, so that fishermen can still retain portions of a closed fishing area to make a living. Because the loss of an entire season, or the loss of the most lucrative part of a season for whale protection, is not something that many fishing families can recover from to come back the next year.
Thank you. Mr. Cannings for 2.5 minutes, please.
Okay, I'm going to turn back to Dr. Brown. You indicated that perhaps Canada and the United States have similar regulations and measures that they're promoting, but that in the United States there wasn't as much enforcement. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'd say it's correct to say there isn't as much enforcement, but the measures are not exactly the same. For example, in the U.S., they use what they call the sinking ground line rule in pot fisheries. And so you have a number of pots on the bottom in a trawl, like charms on a bracelet, and there's ground line that connects all of those pots. And they required all of their fishermen to use rope that would sink and sit on the bottom. And many U.S. colleagues are of the opinion we should also use that in Canada. We use different measures in Canada that are tailored towards the Canadian fisheries. And I would say, I think the one thing that's important is there has been some progress made on rope on demand technology and other modifications, but this is something that really needs an infusion of money to allow the fishermen to get the gear in their hands and practice with it. We work locally with some rock crab fishermen that get shut down when right whales appear around the Bay of Fundy. And they are now in a position where they can actually switch over to some rope on demand gear that we loan them and keep fishing when the right whales show up. It's also quite so right whales do aggregate in feeding areas, but they also have to migrate through other waters to get there. We have the feeding areas fairly well identified in the Gulf. And some of these whale sightings, as Mr. Sproul referred to, are right whales that are seen migrating. And we do need a little bit better science and a little bit better surveillance to see if those whales are persisting in that area, so that if there is a short-term closure, that's one thing. But if that closure goes from 15 days to a seasonal closure, it really wipes out a community's effort to be able to harvest, especially lobster. So I think more surveillance in these areas, especially this time of the year when the animals are just migrating through and moving into the feeding areas, would be really useful to helping fishermen live with the right whale challenge, especially in the Gulf of St. Lawrence.
A minute. Well, thank you. So I guess we have a species here that is very sensitive, very vulnerable. Populations seem to have increased until I just looked at a trend line of 2015, and they've been declining ever since. After all these measures we're taking, why is that population still declining? Is it still vessel strikes and entanglements, or is there something else going on with ocean temperatures or something like that? What's causing that continued decline?
It is vessel strikes and gear entanglements, but it's also climate change. And so the population basically grew from less than 200 animals to almost 500 by 2010. And then we started to see a decline. This coincided with increasing temperatures in the Gulf of Maine that affected their plankton. And so the animals had to go look for food somewhere else. And some of them did that in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, where there weren't any protection measures in place because we didn't anticipate the whales moving to that area. We had no means to do that. And so it's common for a wild animal to also go through a reduced reproduction at times when there's food stress. And I think that's went on. And so right now, yes, the population decreased quite sharply, especially from 2017 up until the year before last. But now it looks like it's leveling out, and a little bit of time will tell. But again, it is the whales have to take care of the reproduction side, but we have to take care of the vessel strikes and the gear entanglements.
Thank you.
Next on the list for the remaining 2 minutes or so, would you like to go ahead? Go ahead.
Oui, merci, Madame Chair. Oui. Absolument.
Thank you, Madam Chair. My question is for Mr. Sproul. Earlier, you said that the government can provide more help to make sure that fishing is more prosperous. You mentioned that there are no longer any ambassadors named by the government. Is there anything else that can help fisheries bloom?
Thank you. I think that's a really important question. First and foremost, I would implore the government to continue to fund the excellent and important work of people like Dr. Brown at the Canadian Whale Institute, and particularly the Canadian Wildlife Federation and the Marine Animal Response Society and the Campobello Whale Rescue Team. I think that that's really important, but also to continue to fund science in the lobster industry so that we can better understand lobster migration and abundance patterns if the need arrives to shift our fishing effort due to the presence of whales. I think that we all need to recognize that Canada sometimes goes to great efforts in agriculture, in mining, in softwood lumber, in auto manufacturing to defend the interest of Canadian business people and Canadian workers abroad. And I think that the efforts that have taken place in the fishery, pale in comparison to any of those. But we've seen the department's own staff detail the incredible economic value the fishery is delivering to Canada at this point. And I think it's time for fishermen and fisheries to get their fair share of government support. And I think that telling the tale of Canadian fisheries and how sustainable they are and how responsible they are on an international level is the best way to advance this industry.
C'est bien, hein? C'est une bonne. Good place to end. Merci.
Thank you.
Thank you very much to the valuable information from our witnesses. It's very much appreciated. All right. Thank you to the committee. Move adjournment.
Thank you.